So I want you to try something for a second. Just think of a concept, something entirely abstract.
Like what?
Like justice or efficiency or, I don't know, even just the idea of the future.
Okay, got it.
Right. So now I want you to notice how your brain just processed that thought. You likely visualized words. Or maybe you imagined like a categorized list of ideas.
Silently scrolling through your mind. Yeah, like a document.
Exactly, like a document. But what if I told you that the very mechanics of how you just formed that thought, the actual physiological and psychological process happening in your head right now, is fundamentally biologically different from how a human being formed a thought, say, 5,000 years ago?
It is a pretty jarring realization, honestly, because we tend to think of the human mind as this constant thing throughout history, just dealing with different sets of information depending on the era.
Yeah, we think ancient people were just like us, but, without Wi-Fi.
Exactly. But the reality is far stranger.
It really is. So, welcome to the Deep Dive. We are jumping into a massive exploration today of human communication, human consciousness, and how the tools we use to speak and write actually rewrite our neurology.
It's a huge topic.
Massive. We're going to be swimming in the waters of Walter J. Ong's 1982 masterpiece, Orality and Literacy, the technologizing of the word. But we have a huge stack of sources here to help us unpack it.
Yeah, we've got critical reviews and historical analyses from scholars like Thomas J. Farrell, Wallace A. Bacon, Jerry Hart,
John Hartley, and Paul McDowell.
Right.
Plus, obviously, a lot of Ong's broader work.
Right.
And the mission today is to figure out how the invention of the alphabet didn't just record human thought, it completely restructured it.
Yeah. And to really grasp the gravity of this shift, you have to understand the mind that mapped it out. I mean, Walter J. Ong wasn't just like a media theorist in a vacuum.
Not at all.
He was a Jesuit priest, he was a professor of English, and honestly, an absolute polymath.
Yeah, his background is wild.
It is. He did his doctoral work at Harvard under Perry Miller.
And Miller was basically a titan of American intellectual history, right?
Exactly. And Ong was there studying a 16th century philosopher named Peter Ramus. But crucially, and this is a big one, Ong was a student of Marshall McLuhan.
Oh, wow. The medium is the message guy.
That's the one. So if McLuhan gave us that famous phrase, Ong gave us the meticulous, historical and psychological blueprint of exactly how that medium changes the mind.
What really stands out immediately in these sources is just the sheer scale of his curiosity. I mean, he's connecting ancient Sumerian cuneiform to the printing press and then projecting those insights all the way forward into modern computers.
He really saw the whole timeline.
He did. But I want to talk about the Jesuit priest aspect for a second.
Yeah.
Because at first glance, you might wonder, why is a Catholic priest spending his entire life analyzing the structural mechanics of the alphabet?
Right. It seems like a disconnect, but it's actually the key to his entire philosophy.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, as a Jesuit, Ong's intellectual framework was deeply rooted in what's called incarnational theology.
Okay, break that down for us.
So, incarnational theology is the belief that the divine, the abstract, the ultimate truths of the universe, they aren't just floating around in some detached ethereal realm.
Right.
They are made flesh.
Yeah.
They are literally bound to the physical material world. And Ong simply applied that theological lens to human language and consciousness.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Yeah. He believed that our purest abstractions, our highest philosophies, are never just, angelic thoughts. They are profoundly shaped by the material conditions of our communication.
I actually found a piece of early poetry he wrote that perfectly captures this.
Oh, let's hear it.
So he was heavily influenced by Gerard Manley Hopkins, another Jesuit poet, and Ong wrote this line. He said, "Leashed, lashed to sense, angels may pry God's secrets better man's poor soul have done till loose comes recompense."
That is so evocative.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
He's essentially agonizing over the fact that human beings are tethered to their physical senses. We can't think like angels. We have to think through our bodies, our eyes, our ears.
And that poetic realization, that becomes his life's academic pursuit.
Exactly.
Because if human thought is, as he says, leashed to sense, then what happens when you introduce a technology like the phonetic alphabet that shifts the primary sense we use to gather knowledge?
Shifting it from our ears to our eyes.
Right. If you change the sensory input, you change the nature of the abstractions the mind can produce.
It's a complete hardware update.
Totally. But before we get to the mechanics of that, we have to look at the environment Ong himself was operating in. Because to understand his theory, you really need to understand the post-World War II American intellectual project.
Let's pull from John Hartley's analysis here, because Hartley frames Ong's work within this concept he calls Americanism.
Yes, Hartley makes a really fascinating observation. In the decades following World War II, the United States found itself in this unprecedented position of global hegemonic power.
They were the superpower.
Right. And within American academia at that time, there was this implicit, sometimes almost unconscious assumption that American democratic ideals and the American way of structuring knowledge were universally applicable to the entire human race.
So it was like a project of intellectual expansionism.
Exactly the tension we need to keep in mind.
So when Ong sits down to map the evolution of consciousness from ancient tribes to modern scholars, he truly believes he's describing a universal human journey.
He does, but Hartley is essentially raising a flag here. He's pointing out that Ong's tendency to make these massive universalizing claims is very much a product of a specific era of American dominance.
Meaning he might be projecting a highly literate Western framework onto the rest of human history.
That's the critique, yeah. And Jerry Harp, another scholar in our stack, approaches this from a slightly different angle. Harp suggests we shouldn't just read Ong as a media ecologist.
Right, he calls him a cultural critic.
Yes, a cultural critic and a relationist, meaning Ong believed absolutely everything was connected. He was obsessed with the dynamics between insiders and outsiders and how our deepest, most primitive evolutionary impulses crash into the highly structured technological world we've built.
Which brings up one of my favorite details from Harp's research.
The Boy Scouts thing.
The Boy Scouts thing.
Yeah.
So when Walter Ong was just 16 years old, freshly graduated from high school in 1929, he got a job writing for the Kansas City Post-Journal.
Which is wild.
Right. And he wrote 23 articles covering the Boy Scouts World Jamboree.
Which is a remarkable output for a teenager, but what's vital is what he was observing there.
Yeah, because you'd think he'd just be writing about, like, campfire songs and international flags.
Right, typical local news fluff.
But even at 16, Ong was analyzing human psychology. He wrote that boys naturally possess a, quote, gang spirit and the itch for adventure.
He was already looking at tribal dynamics.
Exactly. And he explicitly stated that if these primal evolutionary desires are left unguided, they lead to hoodlumism.
Hoodlumism. What a great word.
It is. He thought the Boy Scouts were brilliant, not because they suppressed human nature. He actually thought suppressing human nature was impossible.
Right, it's futile.
But because they provided an architecture to channel those primitive tendencies into something constructive.
It's a stunning piece of foreshadowing, honestly. That 16-year-old observing the raw impulses of boys in a camp is using the exact same analytical muscle the 70-year-old scholar will use to observe the raw impulses of oral cultures.
He was always looking at how human beings manage their oldest, deepest drives.
Always. And we see this fully formed in his 1945 cultural critique of mass media, specifically comic books.
The 1945 article, The Comics in the Superstate. I have to say, reading his take on Superman through a modern lens is wild.
Oh, it really is.
Because today, Superman is the quintessential American Boy Scout. But Ong saw something deeply concerning.
Well, he was looking at a culture printing millions of these comic books every month. And he didn't just see harmless entertainment.
No, he saw what did he call it? A skirming mass of psychological forces.
Right. Ong argued that Superman was a raw, elemental prototype. He was built on a primitive, almost infantile pattern that catered to the dream world of a maladjusted psyche.
A world where complex, nuanced societal problems are solved by just the steady application of brute force.
Exactly.
Now, just to be clear for everyone listening, we are not taking a political side here on comic books or modern politics. We're purely looking at Ong's historical media analysis from 1945.
Yes, completely impartial historical review here.
Right. But his concern in that context was that if an entire society is gorging on media, where the ultimate solution to any problem is an invincible strongman punching it, that society is cultivating a totalitarian mindset.
That was his fear. It primes the populace to look for a single powerful figure to guarantee their safety.
Bypassing the difficult, abstract work of democratic negotiation.
Exactly. Ong was analyzing the infrarational waves of human behavior. He wasn't saying ban comic books. He was saying, look at what this medium is doing to the subconscious architecture of your mind.
Which is such a nuanced take for 1945. And the contrast to his Superman critique is his deep affection for Walt Kelly's Pogo comic strips.
Which is such a funny juxtaposition.
It really is. Like, Superman is dangerous, but the swamp possum is high art. Why did he love Pogo so much?
Because of the language. Walt Kelly used incredibly complex avant-garde linguistic play in Pogo.
He actually compared Kelly to James Joyce, didn't he?
Yes, James Joyce and Gertrude Stein. Where Superman relied on a regression to visual, brute force simplicity, Pogo relied on linguistic innovation.
It demanded that the reader actively engage and interpret and really wrestle with the words.
Right. Ong felt that this kind of linguistic play keeps our sensibilities moving. It acts as an antidote to the somnolence of totalitarian thinking because it forces you to remain conscious, critical, and agile.
Wow. That perfectly bridges us to the core of his life's work. If linguistic play is the pinnacle of a conscious, critical society, we need to figure out where that language came from in the first place.
We have to go back to the beginning.
Right. We have to strip away the printing press, strip away the alphabet, and go all the way back to the default setting of the human brain, primary orality.
Okay, so primary orality refers to cultures that have absolutely no knowledge of writing or print.
None at all.
None. They have no concept of an alphabet, no hieroglyphs, no way to visually record a thought. The only way language exists is as spoken sound.
And we have to remember that for tens of thousands of years, this was the exclusive condition of humanity.
Exactly. The phonetic alphabet is a relatively recent invention, only a few thousand years old.
So the foundation of Ong's theory about primary orality leans heavily on this massive historical detective story from the 1920s and 30s.
Oh, the Milman-Parry stuff.
Yes, involving a scholar named Milman Parry, who completely upended our understanding of the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Milman-Parry's discovery is truly one of the greatest paradigm shifts in literary history.
It blew my mind when I read it. Set the stage for us. What did people think Homer was doing?
Well, for centuries, the assumption in the West was that Homer was an individual genius, an author who sat down and brilliantly composed these massive, intricate, epic poems.
Like a Greek Shakespeare writing at a desk.
Right. But Parry analyzed the specific structure of the Greek text and realized something shocking. The Homeric epics were not written at all. They were assembled.
Okay, but how exactly does someone assemble a 15,000-line poem without writing it down?
Through oral formulas.
Formulas?
Yeah. Parry proved that the poems were constructed out of prefabricated rhythmic blocks of language. These are the famous epithets like the wine-dark sea or wily Odysseus or rosy-fingered dawn.
Right, you hear those repeated constantly in the texts.
And people used to think those were just artistic flourishes, chosen for their poetic beauty in the moment.
But they weren't.
No, they were rigid, metrical formulas engineered to fit the dactylic hexameter of the poem.
So they are essentially mnemonic life rafts.
Exactly.
Because in a purely oral culture, you can't just think a complex thought and leave it there. If you don't lock it into a memorable rhythmic pattern, the thought vanishes the moment the sound stops echoing in the air.
Precisely. You don't have a notebook to store the information, so the language itself has to act as the storage device.
That is wild.
Heavy rhythm, repetition, and formulaic phrasing are absolute necessities for survival. The culture's history, its laws, its technological knowledge like how to build a boat or how to forge a weapon are all encoded in these epic songs.
This completely changes how we view ancient cognition. And it brings me to Thomas J. Farrell's review in our stack of sources.
Farrell's piece is excellent.
It really is. Farrell tries to explain the sheer magnitude of this cognitive shift by using the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle's concepts of potency and act.
Yes.
Can you break down how Farrell maps ancient Greek philosophy onto human neurology? Because I found this fascinating.
It's a highly effective framework. So Aristotle argued that things exist in two states: a state of potential, which is potency, and a state of actualization, which is the act.
Give us an example.
Sure. A seed has the potency to become a tree, but it requires the right environmental conditions to actuate into a full-grown oak.
Got it.
So Farrell, drawing on the fieldwork of psychologists and classicists like A.R. Luria and Eric Havelock, applies this to the human brain.
Okay.
The argument is that Homo sapiens are born with the biological hardware, the inherent potential for highly explicit, abstract thinking, discursive reasoning, and complex formal logic. We have the potency.
But without a specific tool, we can't fully access it.
Exactly.
I thought about it this way. Think of your brain as a smartphone, straight off the factory line. The physical hardware, the silicon chips, the battery, the screen, has the potential to execute incredibly complex tasks, like editing a video or rendering a 3D map. But if you turn it on and there's no operating system installed, you can't do any of that. It's just glowing glass. The hardware is there, but the potential hasn't been actuated.
That is exactly what Farrell is arguing regarding literacy. The technology of the phonetic alphabet is the operating system.
Wow.
Moving from an oral tradition to a literate one isn't just about learning to read. It is the installation of a technology that allows the brain to shift from concrete, operational, present tense thinking into explicit, abstract conceptualization. Literacy is the technology that actuates our cognitive potential.
I need to stop and really chew on that for a second.
Yeah.
Because the implications are staggering.
They really are.
You're saying an oral culture is running on a fundamentally different cognitive operating system than a literate culture.
Yeah.
It's not a matter of intelligence at all.
Not at all.
It's purely a matter of the tools available to process reality.
It is entirely about the tools. And the shift doesn't just change what we think about. It changes the physiological balance of our sensory perception.
Meaning our actual senses?
Yes. Marshall McLuhan and later researchers like Paul D. MacLean, who mapped the triune brain, pointed out that human consciousness relies on synthesizing data from all our senses. But different communication technologies alter the ratio of those senses.
Right, because primary orality creates an intense auditory dominance.
Exactly.
In an oral tribe, truth and memory live exclusively in sound. If you want to know the law, you had to literally listen to the elder speak it.
But the invention of the alphabet fosters a visual dominance. You're looking at arbitrary marks on a piece of clay or papyrus.
The truth is no longer an invisible vibration in the air.
Right. You become something you can look at, point to, and freeze in time.
And Farrell argues that this specific shift to visual dominance is the only thing that makes high-level abstract philosophy possible.
He does.
He uses Plato as the prime example, which is so ironic considering Plato's relationship with writing.
Oh, it is a massive historical irony. But look at Plato's entire philosophical system. It revolves around the concept of forms.
Right, the idea that beyond our physical world, there exists an abstract, perfect, unchanging essence of everything.
Exactly. There is a perfect form of a circle, a perfect form of justice, a perfect form of a chair.
Okay, so how does that connect to visual dominance?
Farrell points out that a purely oral, oddist culture simply cannot conceptualize a Platonic form. Because in an oral culture, reality is an event.
It's an action.
It is a sounding action happening right now. The idea of an abstract, silent, unchanging visual essence floating outside of time is completely unintelligible unless your brain has been rewired by literacy to think in visual, static space.
That is just mind-bending. The foundation of Western thought, the very concept of abstract philosophy, was only made possible because a handful of Greeks downloaded the alphabet operating system, which hijacked their brains, turned down the volume on their ears, and turned up the processing power of their eyes.
Exactly. It's a physiological restructuring. But this raises the most compelling question of Ong's work.
What's that?
If literacy actuates abstract reasoning through visual dominance, what does the cognitive landscape of a purely oral mind actually look like?
Right. If we strip away the alphabet, how does a human being process the universe?
This takes us into the absolute heart of the book, where Ong maps out the psychodynamics of orality.
Chapter 3, right?
Yep, chapter 3. He identifies 9 specific characteristics of orally based thought.
And reading through these is like looking at a mirror image of how we are taught to think today. I really want to spend time on this because every single one of these points flips our modern assumptions upside down.
They really do. Let's begin with the first characteristic. Oral thought is additive rather than subordinative.
Unpack the linguistic mechanics of that for us. What does subordinative mean in this context?
Well, think about a modern written legal contract.
Okay.
It is full of subordinate clauses, whereas, therefore, in the event that, it relies on complex grammar that nests ideas inside one another, creating a hierarchy of logic.
Right, it's very structured.
And that is subordinative thinking. It requires a text because you need to be able to visually scan back and forth to keep track of the complex grammatical architecture.
You can't just hold all those whereases in your head.
Exactly. Oral thought cannot do this. Instead, it is additive. It strings events together with simple conjunctions, mostly just the word and.
Ong uses the early translations of Genesis as an example of this, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
because the creation story was born in an oral tradition. Just listen to the cadence. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved, and God said, "Let there be light."
Wow. It is a very rhythmic additive progression. It flows like a river of sound.
Which leads to the second point. Oral thought is aggregative rather than analytic.
This ties directly back to Milman Parry's Homeric formulas, doesn't it?
It does. Literate minds love to analyze things. We love to break them apart into their smallest components. But an oral mind aggregates. It clusters concepts together tightly.
So you don't just refer to a princess.
Right. She is the beautiful princess. An oak isn't just an oak, it's the sturdy oak.
Because if you separate the adjective from the noun, you destroy the rhythm, and if you destroy the rhythm, you lose the memory.
Exactly. Breaking the phrase apart to analyze it is intellectually destructive in an oral culture.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
All right, characteristic number 3. It is redundant or copious. This one really highlights the physical limitations of sound.
Yeah, think about what happens when you are reading a dense book and you lose your train of thought. What do?
I just let my eyes drop back a few lines and reread it.
Exactly. But in a primary oral culture, the phrase, look it up, or let me review that, is literal nonsense.
Because sound only exists as it is perishing.
Right. Once a word is spoken, it is gone forever. Therefore, the speaker must constantly loop back, repeating previous points, circling the topic to keep both themselves and the audience anchored.
So what a modern editor would cross out with a red pen as repetitive fluff, an oral society requires as a structural load-bearing pillar.
Beautifully put, yes.
Which brings us to the 4th point. Oral societies are fundamentally conservative or traditionalist.
And this is purely a matter of caloric and cognitive economics.
Caloric economics.
Yeah. When every single piece of knowledge a society possesses, how to hunt, how to navigate by the stars, the genealogy of the tribe is stored exclusively in human memory. The society must dedicate an enormous amount of energy simply to repeating what has been learned.
Because there is no external hard drive.
None at all. So there is very little tolerance for experimental avant-garde speculation.
Yeah.
If the elders stop repeating the old knowledge to focus on some new radical idea, the old knowledge isn't just temporarily set aside, it vanishes from the universe forever.
Which naturally restricts the kind of knowledge they retain, which is point 5. Knowledge is kept close to the human life world.
Right. You don't have encyclopedias to store objective, abstract facts. You don't teach geometry by drawing abstract theorems on a chalkboard.
Because chalkboards don't exist.
Exactly. An oral culture teaches the principles of geometry by telling a story about how to build a tent or how to divide a field among heirs. Everything must be tied to human action and daily survival.
And often, that action is pretty violent, which is point 6. Oral thought is agonistically toned. It is combative.
Yes. Without writing to store information in a neutral, detached format, knowledge is deeply, inherently personal.
It's always embedded in stories of struggle, physical combat, and intense interpersonal praise or, honestly, vicious verbal abuse.
Think of the tradition of the dozens, or flighting, or even modern rap battles. Knowledge is wielded as a weapon.
Point 7. It is empathetic and participatory rather than objectively distanced.
In a literate culture, we really value the objective observer, the scientist who stands apart from the experiment and views it coldly.
The detached intellectual.
Right. But in an oral culture, to know something is to enter into it. During an oral performance of an epic, the audience doesn't sit quietly and take notes.
They chant, they sway, they breathe with the storyteller.
The knower and the known are fused in this communal trance.
Point 8. Oral cultures are homeostatic. I found this one fascinating because it literally changes the definition of history itself.
Homeostasis means maintaining an equilibrium. Oral societies live in an internal present.
Because they don't have historical documents.
Right, so they naturally slough memories that no longer serve a purpose right now. If a word's meaning changes over a few generations, or if a law becomes obsolete, the old version is simply forgotten.
There are no dictionaries to remind them of semantic history, no archives to point out contradictions.
The past is constantly, subtly rewritten to validate the present.
Wow. And finally, point 9, which really ties it all together. Oral thought is situational rather than abstract. And here, Ong draws heavily on A.R. Luria's fieldwork with the illiterate Uzbek peasants in the 1930s.
Luria's experiments are the definitive proof of this cognitive divide.
Tell us about the experiments.
So Luria would show an illiterate peasant drawings of a hammer, a saw, an axe, and a log, and he would ask them to categorize them.
Okay, so a literate mind instantly says the hammer, saw, and axe are tools. The log is wood. The log doesn't belong. We categorize by abstract classes.
Right. But the illiterate peasants refused to do that.
They refuse.
Completely refuse. They would say, they all belong together. You need the axe to chop the log and the saw to cut it.
Yeah.
And when Luria tried to force them to separate the log, the peasants thought he was being foolish. To them, an axe without a log is useless. They categorize the world situationally, based on human action, not on abstract and visible categories.
Okay, I have to step in here and play devil's advocate for a minute.
Let's do it.
Because mapping out these 9 points, it's incredibly compelling, but it also sounds like we are constructing a massive Great Divide.
Ah, the Great Divide critique.
Right, we are painting this stark binary picture. On one side, you have the primitive, concrete, subjective, oral mind. On the other side, you have the advanced, abstract, objective, literate mind. Paula McDowell's critique in our sources zeroes in on this.
She definitely does.
Doesn't this entire framework risk technological determinism? The idea that the minute you hand a society an alphabet, they automatically and rigidly evolve into Western philosophers. I know scholars like Jack Goody and Ruth Finnegan have hammered on for this false binary.
It is the most robust and persistent critique of Ong's career, and honestly, it is a necessary corrective. History is never as clean as a theoretical binary.
It's always messy.
Always. But Paul McDowell offers a highly nuanced defense of Ong by reframing how we should utilize his work. McDowell argues that we absolutely should not read orality and literacy as a rigid evolutionary binary. Instead, we should view them as a heuristic.
Let's clarify that term for the listener. A heuristic isn't a law of physics. It's more like a mental shortcut, right? It's a conceptual tool or a lens used to organize incredibly complex, messy phenomena.
Exactly. McDowell points out that in the real world, media forms coexist in symbiosis and synergy.
So the invention of the printing press didn't instantly eradicate spoken word.
No, they bled into one another, competed, and merged for centuries. McDowell actually provides a brilliant genealogy of the word orality itself, proving how its meaning constantly morphs depending on the historical and political context.
This is a great historical detour. She looks at how orality has been secularized over time. And just to be completely clear, as we discuss this next example, we are looking strictly at historical jurisprudence and media analysis. We aren't using this to make contemporary political points.
Right. Purely historical analysis here.
So McDowell cites a 1941 article by a scholar named Taylor Cole about the Nazi labor courts.
Yes. Taylor Cole observed that these courts operated on what he explicitly called a principle of orality. Now, in 1941 Germany, orality didn't mean Homeric poetry or rhythmic epithets.
Yeah.
In this grim context, it meant the weaponization of speed.
How does speed become a weapon in a court?
Think about it. Written law is inherently slow. It requires documentation, precedent, review, and appeals. And that delay, that friction, is what protects civil liberties and individual rights. Cole noted that the Nazi courts bypassed this by using direct word-of-mouth decisions.
Right.
Orality was used to eliminate the protective friction of text, allowing the state to execute its will instantly. It was a tool of authoritarian efficiency.
That is a chilling application of the concept. And McDowell contrasts that mid-20th century secular use with debates from the 17th century, right?
Yes, she looks at the year 1666 and the intense debates between the Catholic and Anglican churches over the orality of the rule of faith.
What was the core of that debate?
In that era, orality was a massive theological battleground. The core question was, does divine truth live in the spoken, continuous tradition of the church hierarchy, or does it live exclusively in the frozen, written text of the scriptures?
So McDowell's point is that orality isn't just one static thing. It's a complex, shifting battleground of ideas.
It is, but, and this is crucial, even acknowledging the messiness of history and the validity of the Great Divide critique, Ong's core observation remains unbelievably potent.
You mean the idea that writing changes us?
Yes. Even as a heuristic, the realization that writing mechanically restructures the way we process reality is undeniable when you actually look at the physical mechanics of text.
Which brings us to the pivot point of Ong's thesis. Writing is completely artificial.
And we really have to strip the negative connotation away from the word artificial here. Ong meant it as the highest compliment.
How so?
Speech is natural. Every neurologically healthy human infant, if surrounded by speaking adults, will naturally absorb and produce spoken language. But no one, no matter how long they stare at a book, naturally learns to read or write.
Right. Writing is a technology. It is as contrived and engineered as a microchip or a combustion engine.
Exactly.
It's a set of rigid, arbitrary rules for translating invisible sound vibrations into visual marks in space.
And because it is an artificial technology, it does something speech can never do. It separates the knower from the known.
Explain the psychological impact of that separation, because I think this is huge.
It is. When I speak to you right now, my words are tied to my physical presence. You hear my tone, you gauge my intent through my pacing. The knowledge is an event happening between us.
Right, it's alive in the room.
But when I write a book, I externalize my thoughts. I pour them into a technology. Those words are now separated from my body. They become autonomous.
So a book can be read hundreds of years after the author has turned to dust by someone halfway across the planet.
And this separation allows for a level of introspection, a cold, objective analysis that is biologically impossible in a tribal, purely oral setting.
Because you can't step back and analyze a spoken word that's already gone.
Precisely. Furthermore, this external storage system leads to the development of what scholars like E.D. Hirsch and Basil Bernstein call the graphylect.
The graphylect. This is one of the most fascinating concepts in media ecology for me. What exactly is a graphylect?
A graphylect is a transdialectal language that has been forged and expanded by a deep, centuries-long commitment to writing and print. Standard English is a graphylect. Because it has been recorded, categorized, and printed massively over centuries, Standard English possesses a recorded vocabulary of over 1.5 million words.
1.5 million words.
Think about that number. Compare that to a purely oral dialect, which might max out at a few thousand words.
Right, because human memory simply cannot retain 1.5 million distinct vocabulary items without an external hard drive.
It's impossible. The graphylect gives the literate mind a vast, finely differentiated conceptual toolkit. It allows for a microscopic precision of thought that simply cannot be sustained in an oral culture.
Because writing locks those words into visual, physical space.
Mm-hmm.
And once we transition from handwritten manuscripts to the mechanical printing press, words literally become physical objects.
Little blocks of lead pressed onto paper.
Typography changes everything. It creates an intense visual tidiness. I was thinking about the invention of the alphabetical index.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
In a manuscript culture, where every handwritten copy was slightly different, indexing was a nightmare. But identical printed pages allowed for precise, uniform indexing. Print enforces a relentless spatial logic on language.
It also creates a psychological sense of closure. When you hold a printed, bound book with its justified margins and crisp white space, it feels final.
It feels like the definitive word on a subject.
Yes, in a way that a fluid, ever-changing spoken tale never does. Ong highlights this profound shift by pointing to learned Latin.
Oh, right.
During the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, learned Latin was a bizarre linguistic phenomenon. It was spoken aloud in universities, but its vocabulary and grammar were entirely controlled by written texts.
So it wasn't anyone's mother tongue. Babies didn't naturally learn it at home.
Nope. It was a language of pure textuality that programmatically fostered an intense, literate objectivity.
So humans have built this massive, artificial visual technology that completely alters how we interact with reality. But what I find hilarious, and honestly deeply relevant for anyone listening right now, is how we historically react to new technologies.
We always panic.
We do. Think about all the complaints you hear today about screens, smartphones, and social media. They are making us antisocial. They are destroying our attention spans and our memory. They are unnatural.
The historical irony is exquisite. If you read Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus, the character of Socrates, launches into a bitter complaint against the newest, most disruptive technology of his day.
The invention of writing.
Exactly.
Socrates basically sounds like a boomer complaining about iPhones.
Right.
What were his specific grievances against the alphabet?
He argued that writing is inhuman because it attempts to establish outside the mind what can only truly exist inside the mind.
Okay.
He argued that it will destroy human memory, making people reliant on external marks rather than internal retention.
Which, to be fair, he was kind of right about.
He was. And perhaps most profoundly, he argued that a written text is unresponsive. If you ask a text a question, it just gives you the exact same words back. It can't defend itself in a debate.
The exact complaints we make about computers today were made 2,500 years ago about the alphabet. It just proves how inherently traumatic technological shifts are to our collective psyche.
It does. But we also have to engage with the modern pushback against Ong's specific claims about these shifts.
Right. Let's bring in Wallace Bacon's critique from the journal Philosophy and Rhetoric. Because Bacon was quite skeptical of Ong's sweeping generalizations.
He was.
He argued that to swallow Ong's entire theory requires a bit of a leap of faith, mostly because Ong sketches out the physiological processes of the human mind far too briefly.
Bacon's critique is definitely valid. Ong is painting the entire history of human consciousness with an incredibly broad brush, and sometimes the neurobiological details are glossed over in favor of grand cultural theory. However, Thomas J. Farrell, in his review, doesn't pull back. He actually pushes Ong's theory even further down the rabbit hole.
How so?
Farrell focuses on the psychological fallout of the printing press. He argues that the invention of letterpress printing didn't just increase our visual dominance. It created an extreme visualism that fundamentally broke modern philosophy.
Extreme visualism.
What's
I need you to unpack that. How does looking at a printed page break philosophy?
Farrell posits that because literate typographic cultures rely so heavily on text, modern philosophers began to unwittingly use sight as the sole analog for all knowing. If you can't see it clearly, it isn't true.
Okay.
But sight has an inherent physical limitation for the horizon. You can only see so far before things blur into nothingness.
Right.
Farrell argues this visual limitation infected the philosophy of thinkers like Immanuel Kant.
The 18th century philosopher.
Right. Kant argued for the existence of the noumenon, or the thing in itself, the true reality of an object that humans can never actually access because we are trapped behind our sensory data.
So how does Farrell connect that to extreme visualism?
Farrell suggests Kant only reached this conclusion because his typography-addled brain assumed that, just as physical sight has an unreachable horizon, abstract knowledge must also have an unreachable horizon.
That is wild. And Farrell applies this to modern post-structuralism too, right? Like
Yeah.
Jacques Derrida and deconstructionism.
Yes. Derrida famously argued that there is nothing outside the text, that language is just an endless play of signs, constantly differing meaning, and true objective reality is inaccessible.
So Farrell views that as a symptom of this print-induced mindset.
Exactly. Farrell views this as the ultimate symptom of extreme visualism. Deconstructionism is what happens when a mind becomes so completely trapped in the visual matrix of the printed graphylect that it denigrates the other senses, sound, touch, immediate physical presence, and begins to doubt the existence of the external world entirely.
That is a staggering diagnosis of modern thought. But the isolation of the writer and this intense visual locking of the word didn't just break philosophy. It fundamentally altered human storytelling and how we perceive human character.
This is one of Ong's most beautiful literary insights, honestly. As literacy and print deeply interiorized human consciousness, forcing us into solitary, silent reading literature, experienced a profound inward narrative turn.
Contrast the heroes of oral epics with the heroes of modern novels for us.
Sure. In a primary oral epic, characters like Achilles or Beowulf are what E.M. Forster called flat or heavy characters.
They are larger-than-life types.
Right. They are defined entirely by their external actions, their public virtues, their armor, and their lineage. An oral culture doesn't have the luxury of exploring a character's nuanced internal psychological neuroses.
Because it's too abstract to remember without writing.
Exactly. But with the rise of print and the solitary introspective act of reading a book in silence, we get the birth of the round character.
Like,
we see this cognitive shift begin to take hold with Shakespeare's Hamlet, a character paralyzed by his own internal introspective monologue, and it fully blossoms with the invention of the modern novel.
characters gain rich, deeply complex interior lives.
Yes. The narrative focus shifts from external physical combat on a battlefield to internal psychological exploration within the mind.
But the evolution of the medium didn't stop with the Gutenberg press. We eventually invented the telegraph, the telephone, the radio, and television.
The electronic era.
Right. And Ong categorizes this electronic era as secondary orality.
Secondary orality is a fascinating paradox. It relies entirely on the prior existence of writing and print culture. You cannot build a television network, launch a satellite, or write code without massive, highly structured literacy.
But the output of that technology recreates the communal auditory experience of our ancient past.
Precisely. Electronic media recreates the participatory feeling of primary orality. You have massive audiences, millions of people listening to the same voice or watching the same event simultaneously.
It creates what Marsh McLuhan famously dubbed the global village.
However, Ong stresses a critical distinction here. Secondary orality is not a regression to primary orality because it is highly self-conscious.
What does that mean in practice?
In an ancient oral tribe, a storyteller's spontaneity is a natural requirement of the medium. On television or radio, spontaneity is meticulously planned.
Well, for sure.
We write scripts, rehearse them for weeks, and use teleprompters just to make it sound like we aren't reading scripts.
We engineer authenticity. And this is where Ong's theories brilliantly predict the modern digital landscape. Jerry Harp provides a fantastic example of this intersection in his analysis of late 20th century subway graffiti.
I love this example because it bridges the analog and the digital so perfectly. Harp looks at the intense graffiti culture of the 70s and 80s and describes it as a highly literate puberty rite.
It's a perfect analysis.
Yeah.
These young writers were using the graphical letters, words, typography as their medium.
Yeah.
They were courting physical danger to build their identity in a mass tech society. But because their art was illegal, they had to use pseudonyms. So they were engaging in this massive, aggressive public display of text, asserting their existence, while simultaneously hiding their true identities.
It was a search for tribal selfhood within the anonymity of the printed word.
And if we extrapolate from Harp's graffiti example and apply Ong's 9 psychodynamics of orality to today's social media, the parallels are undeniable. If you open your phone right now, you are looking at the exact psychological architecture Ong described.
Walk us through the modern equivalents.
Well, think about X, or Twitter. The entire culture of that platform is heavily agonistically toned.
Oh, absolutely.
It is built almost entirely on argument, combat, quote tweeting, and dunking on your opponents. It is a digital version of ancient tribal flighting or verbal combat.
And consider the hashtags.
Right.
The hashtag is the ultimate manifestation of the aggregative characteristic of orality. You are clustering concepts together like hashtag Monday motivation or hashtag throwback Thursday to make massive amounts of data searchable and memorable. It functions exactly like a Homeric epithet.
And what about the spontaneity of TikTok or Instagram stories?
Yeah.
People spend hours buying ring lights, setting up tripods, and doing 20 takes just to post a 15-second video that is desperately trying to look like a raw, off-the-cuff, spontaneous moment.
It is the exact self-conscious, highly planned secondary orality that Ong warned us about.
We're swimming in a hypervisual graphylect. We consume millions of written words a day on screens, yet we are engaging in the tribal, participatory, agonistic behaviors of an oral village.
Which brings up a really profound tension that runs through all of Ong's work. As you read him, there is this constant push and pull between elegy and celebration.
Between what we have gained through technological progress and what we have tragically lost.
On one hand, scholars like Thomas Farrell suggest that our contemporary electronic sensory mix, the fact that we are listening to podcasts, watching videos, talking on phones, might actually be a healthy corrective.
A corrective to print.
Yeah. It might be checking the dangers of the extreme visualism and isolation that the printing press caused. We are re-engaging our ears and our sense of community.
But on the other hand, what are we sacrificing? If we are constantly immersed in the participatory noise, the constant notifications, and the tribal combat of the global village, are we losing the capacity for deep, solitary introspection?
That's a real theory.
The kind of slow, autonomous, independent thought that birthed modern science and complex philosophy. Are we losing the roundness of our own characters?
As John Hartley points out in his critique, Ong's work is ultimately the voice of the present, calling into the past, trying to understand how we were built. Because to consciously decide what we want to become, we first have to decipher what we were.
So let's zoom out and look at the massive narrative arc we've just traveled.
It's a long journey.
It really is. We started with the primary orality of Homer and the ancients, a world where knowledge was an ephemeral sound, deeply tied to physical action, human memory, and the immediate, concrete life world.
Then we explored how the invention of the phonetic alphabet and its explosion via the printing press actuated the latent human potential for abstract reasoning.
The technology of writing separated the knower from the known.
It created the massive graphylect, locked words into silent visual space, birthed abstract philosophy, and gave rise to the introspective round characters of the modern era.
And finally, we collided with the secondary orality of the digital age, where electronic media relies on an invisible foundation of massive literacy, but recreates the communal, tribal, combative dynamics of our ancient past, wrapped in a veneer of self-conscious authenticity.
Our consciousness is not a static thing. It is deeply, inextricably intertwined with our communication technologies.
It is a continuous biological and psychological evolution of the human psyche, shaped entirely by the tools we invent to express ourselves.
The ultimate takeaway here is profound.
It is. The next time you shoot out a quick text message or sit down in silence to read a novel or record a video for social media, I want you to realize that you are not just exchanging information. You are actively utilizing tools that have literally sculpted the physiological and psychological capabilities of your brain over millennia.
That is the enduring legacy of Walter J. Ong's life's work. The medium isn't just the message. The medium is the literal architecture of our minds.
Which leaves us with one final, slightly terrifying thought to mull over. A thought that extends Ong's timeline into a completely new paradigm.
Oh boy, what is it?
Ong showed us that writing isolated the individual, while secondary orality created a self-conscious global village. But what happens to human consciousness when we fully enter the era of artificial intelligence?
The tertiary stage.
Exactly. If a machine can now flawlessly mimic both the conversational spontaneity and empathy of primary orality while simultaneously wielding the massive million-word database of the printed graphylect, how will our brains adapt?
That's a great question.
Will we form a tertiary consciousness? One that is no longer based on human-to-human communication, but on human-to-machine communion. How does the operating system of the human brain rewrite itself when the tool it's talking to is actually smarter than the human?
That is a staggering horizon to contemplate. And honestly, it proves that On's map of the mind is more relevant today than it was the day he published it.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the technologizing of the word. Keep paying attention to how you think.